As some of you may know, Asia Society is a global non-profit educational organization that curates initiatives across the arts, business, policy, and geopolitics with a network of centers around the world. At the India Center, which is located in Mumbai, we focus our programming on the broader South Asian region. Our shared histories, contemporary cultures, our economies, the challenges we face, and the ideas that shape our present and future. Part of our mandate is to spotlight and platform important voices from South Asia, and one of our marquee initiatives is the annual Asia Arts Game Changer Awards, where we celebrate pioneering and emerging artists from across South Asia. We hosted the 9th edition of the awards just last week in Delhi during the India Art Fair, where we had the opportunity to recognize 4 amazing artists from India and Pakistan. The recipient of our Asia Arts Future Award was the amazing collective Karachi LaJamia, comprised of artists Shahana Rajani and Zahra Malkani from Pakistan. Unfortunately, Shahana and Zahra couldn't join us in person in India, but we're so happy to be presenting an artist talk by them today as part of Kala. It seems fitting that we're doing this in Sri Lanka, particularly fitting that we're doing this in Sri Lanka, which is home to one of our past future awardees as well, Jasmine Nilani Joseph, who's sitting right here, whose evocative work we love and admire so much. Let me introduce our speakers for today. Karachi LaJamia is an anti-institutional art collective based in Karachi, founded by Zahra and Shahana. Conceptualized as a nomadic space that experiments with radical pedagogies and art practices, Zahra and Shahana's work is process-oriented and collaborative. They host sessions with participants in different public spaces and work with local initiatives and activists to build solidarity in the face of the military state. The emphasis here is on how art might facilitate a struggle over the city, whose it is, whose it might be, and the ways one comes to claim its past and present. By creating an aesthetic modality for grappling with the lived socio-political and geographic landscapes of metropolitan Pakistan, Karachi LaJamia offers a new ethical grammar for how art can become resistance in turbulent times. In this, the learnings they produce an archive. In this, the learnings they produce and archive are relevant beyond the boundaries of Karachi. They reach out towards India, Sri Lanka, and other parts of South Asia, with our own tensions and intricate tragic histories, as well as the idea of unremitting struggle. The program today is in 2 parts. We begin with a presentation by Shahana and Zahra, which will be followed by a discussion between them and Meghal Pereira, an interdisciplinary researcher-writer based in Colombo, with interests in urban infrastructure, public space, and critical mapping. The idea here is to form links between what we see in Karachi, what we see in Colombo, and other parts of South Asia as well. Thank you, Shahana, Zahra, and Meghal for being a part of this program. And a special thank you to Saskia, Michelle, and the whole team of Kala for your support in putting this together. Before we begin, we play a short film on Karachi LaJamia's practice.
Okay, great. Shahana, do you want to go first or should I go?
You go.
Okay. We really think of Karachi LaJamia as a pedagogical experiment that we have been practicing together in Karachi since 2015.
We were both at that time thinking about the politics of map making, the violence and erasures of visuality. And so I feel like both of our interests sort of intersected in really interesting and beautiful ways.
They use the city as a site of study, of intervention, and of collaboration. And in doing this, they challenge and disrupt the mechanisms of institutional knowledge, power, and control. And I think importantly, they do this through building and working with creative and indigenous communities, which I think I would say is one of the most important, but perhaps the only way to do this kind of work effectively.
I think Karachi LaJamia's kind of approach to thinking about the city and ecology is multidimensional, and I think that so much of the ways in which art is taught is centered around vision, and I think that what KLJ does really well is that they kind of make space for different ways of knowing.
तो हमारे शुरू के दिनों में 2013 और 14 में हमारी आवाज़ इतनी बड़ी नहीं थी। जो सबसे पहले जिन लोगों ने हमारा साथ किया, जो हमारे साथ कोलैबोरेट करने आए, जो हमारे पास आए, वो जो पहले दो शख्सियत आई वो शहाना राजानी और ज़हरा मलकानी थी। ये उस वक्त हमारे पास आए जब मीडिया में नहीं सुन रहा था, कहीं से कोई हमें मदद नहीं हो रही थी। हम सोशल मीडिया के जरिए उन्होंने एक एग्जीबिशन कराई कराची के अंदर, जहाँ पे इन्होंने तस्वीरों के जरिए हमारे जो लैंडस्केप है, जो उस वक्त तबाह कर रहे थे, उनको उन्होंने वहाँ पे शो किया वीडियोस के जरिए।
Karachi LaJamia is really imagined as this space that moves outside educational institutions to really find ways of connecting with the city and really build a community where we can come together.
I was personally very much interested to work with Karachi LaJamia. I was also interested to know their practice and how they were using this collective to form this sort of nomadic moving school, which was a fascinating idea to explore. They were also documenting and building dialogues about the recent developments that has been happening in the city, and also the river that is surrounded by it, and the questions of extraction, questions of land, which is obviously often runs through their work.
Even though KLJ is very much outside of institutions and kind of gets you to think about pedagogies that are radical or different, something that is not happening at university campuses, their individual roles as academics at institutions in Karachi is also has to be foregrounded because they've taught a generation of makers.
We were really aware in that moment of a history in Pakistan where art schools were the sites of resistance and where art schools were the sites of protest and where, new practices of resistance were being formulated and experimented with. And we really wanted to work within that spirit and to carry on that spirit in a moment where it felt like it was very much under threat.
It really, over the years, has expanded our sense of what is possible to do in this world in this time in the city.
I'm genuinely beyond thrilled to support the 2025 Asia Arts Future South Asia Award, which goes to the remarkable duo Shahana Rajani and Zahra Malkani for their commitment to the arts. At Imami Art, we're deeply passionate about supporting the next generation of artists, both in India and across South Asia. I hope to see their practice grow and reach larger audiences in the near future.
We are so happy and delighted that we could be here in Colombo and celebrate this really emotional moment for us. We wanted to start by thanking everyone at the Asia Society for this honor and for Kala for hosting us. I feel this has really been we're at the 10-year anniversary of Karachi LaJamia, and it's a moment where we've really been reflecting on the past and what it means to be doing this work now at a time when things really seem to be getting darker. And it means so much to us to receive the support right now, and we're so grateful for it. For the artist talk, we thought we are just going to share how we started out and then some of the projects that we have worked on. So do you mind?
I guess to begin with, there is already a bit of a sense of what Karachi LaJamia is, and based on that wonderful video that was made for us, we really appreciate that. But as Shahana said, Karachi LaJamia has been around for 10 years. We founded Karachi LaJamia in 2015, and it was really in the context of a moment where Shahana and I were both exploring ways of being in the city, practices, research-based art practices in a city like Karachi, which was increasingly being framed in local and international media as one of the most dangerous cities in the world, quote unquote. And yeah, we were thinking of ways of being in the city and thinking of ways of creating practices that engaged with and presented and experimented with new ways of seeing and speaking of and invoking and imagining the city and inhabiting the city. And at the same time, Shahana and I were also teaching at different art institutions in Karachi. And so I think in 2015, we were really experiencing this very specific moment where we felt that there had been a big increase in state surveillance and state policing, specifically of cultural spaces and academic spaces. And we really felt the need in that moment to respond in particular to that. Maybe and so Karachi LaJamia is kind of born of that impulse to respond to these increasing eye and hand of the state, and thinking about ways to bring pedagogy outside of the institution and into the streets of Karachi. And we were also really interested in particular in collaborating with different movements that were happening in Karachi that were dealing with questions of ecology, eviction, etc. We were really aware that despite the increase in state surveillance and policing, we were also really aware that Karachi had an incredibly rich, expansive, intrepid ecosystem of and history of activism. Especially when it came to environmental defense, ecological defense, and land defense. And we really wanted to bring our communities as artists and academics in conversation with those struggles and those movements and those organizations and their histories. So that's kind of the impulse that Karachi LaJamia came from. And so over the years, we've done a series of courses together in collaboration with different activist groups and different movements. And we've also been doing our own, we also have a parallel research practice along with that. But I'll just go back to where, very briefly, where me and Shahana's collaboration began, which began with a project called Exhausted Geographies. And again, Exhausted Geographies was started in 2013. And we were thinking specifically about the city of Karachi and about this moment in which Karachi was being increasingly framed as a city that was overwrought with violence, crime, terror, and where we felt like not only mainstream media, but even in all kind of cultural practices, whether that's art or literature, that the same kind of tropes and cliches of Karachi were being reproduced. And so Shahana and I, Exhausted Geographies came from this desire between Shahana and I to think about Karachi otherwise, but it was really important for us to do that in collaborative ways. And we were really curious and interested in collaborating with and building an interdisciplinary community to do that work together. So Exhausted Geographies was a series of maps and essays that we made with architects, academics, anthropologists, artists, poets, 7 maps, 7 essays. And one of the essays that was in that compilation really became seminal for our practice, but also kind of has really influenced us and our work ever since. And that was an essay by the architect and urbanist, Nausheen Anwar, Dr. Nausheen Anwar, who wrote about the use of terror maps in mainstream media to manufacture consent for the militarization of the city. And so it is really against, so this is an example of these terror maps that were being regularly created and printed in mainstream media to create a sense of pervasive fear around the city. And it was really in response to that pervasive fear and the ways in which that pervasive fear can be mobilized towards militarizing and securitizing and rebuilding the city in this militaristic image. And that connection of militarism and development that we see here in these maps, that the kind of work that we started doing with Karachi LaJamia comes from that.
Yeah, and just kind of thinking about the history and violence of map-making practices, of visual practices, where in Karachi we saw that there is such a long and deep history of the ways in which the city gets represented has really real consequences for obscuring the violence that the paramilitary is kind of laying out on certain neighborhoods. So the Karachi operation specifically was happening in the suburbs of the city, and all of those suburb areas were then being shown as red zones, as no-go zones, and what that was doing was creating this larger public impression in the city that these areas are unsafe and the operation should be done here. But in reality, the military operation is clearing and occupying land and then opening up that land for real estate development. And the communities that were most being affected by the military operation and real estate occupation were indigenous Indian Baloch communities and refugee communities who occupy the outskirts of Karachi. And so when we started Karachi LaJamia, it was both with this desire to build solidarity with ongoing struggles to take pedagogy outside of the institution into the city, but I think we also started with a real awareness of thinking more carefully about visual practice and the history of visual representation, what it has meant, and what are some ways to more responsibly carry out this work. So part of, I guess, the work that Karachi LaJamia has done is a series of research essays and lectures that me and Zahra have been working on since the inception to think through the militarization of the city, of the university, the militarization of representation, and to really think about how the enclosures of land and the enclosures of knowledge are really intertwined and support each other. It's a feedback loop that goes on. And in that way, really seeing that the way in which education is now being taught in universities, again, has really real consequences for the ways in which the younger generation is relating to the city. And the fact that education has been so depoliticized in the university and the art school has a real consequence for the kind of art that's being produced. And we wanted to create spaces, encounters, gatherings to give people a kind of different space and a different opportunity to practice and imagine a politics of relation with the city, where studying is not about being in the security enclaves of a university, but where studying could be about building relation and building solidarity. So we wanted to share today maybe 2 courses very briefly that we have organized over the years. The first public course that we thought we would share today was called Gadab Sessions, and it's a 6-month-long course that we organized in 2016 in collaboration with the Sindh Indigenous Rights Alliance, and Hafiz, who we saw in the video, is a founding member of the Alliance. At that time, there was, so Gadab is on the outskirts of Karachi. It's an indigenous neighborhood that was really being impacted by real estate development at that time, and there was a lot of obscurity and media blackouts around the violence of the occupation and dispossession. And I think at that time we already had relationships and networks with some of these activists, and in conversation and collaboration with them, we decided to host this course where we did an open call and invited anyone who would want to join us. So part of our ethos has been, unlike institutions, universities, and art schools, we didn't want any kind of admission process or criteria process. We wanted to create an open and inclusive space. And so yeah, we just did an open call, gathered a group of, I think we were 13 people from really different disciplines, different ages, different interests. And we spent the next 6 months working with the Indigenous Rights Alliance to visit this neighborhood together, to meet people who are working and struggling against the development, to meet communities who have been impacted, to have different people lead different kinds of pedagogical methods for us. We would go on walks, listening sessions. Indigenous Rights Alliance actually had requested us from the get-go to do a mapping project for them as artists. Because they were so aware of this strategy of erasure that the real estate company was involved in, of repeatedly invoking this area as Banjar, Gairabad, and Gair Mahfuz. Those are always the three tropes that are used of uninhabited, insecure, and barren. This idea of the desert as empty and as wasteland. And so when we approached them, wanted us to help them reinscribe the map and contest the erasure.
Yeah, and just kind of going back to the map form, when you look at that earlier map from 2013, the terror map, the neighborhood that we worked in, Gadap in particular, was also one of the neighborhoods that in 2013, when these maps were being created, was being cast as a no-go zone. And so again, the way in which that map then becomes a reality, in that the map kind of functions to cast that space as what Shahana said, Banjar, Ghairabad, Ghair Mahfuz, barren, insecure, uninhabited. And with Gadap sessions, what we set out to do with this group of students was to spend time learning from the Indigenous Rights Alliance and learning from their methods. I think something that we've been coming back to really often is this idea that the resistance is pedagogy. To study the methods and modes of resistance is kind of a mode of study in itself. And so with the Gadap sessions, when we first had planned on it, we had planned on a 10-week long course. Because everyone's kind of participation is voluntary, and again, it's an interdisciplinary group. We have art students who come join us, but we also have pediatricians, we have activists, we have lawyers, we have a really kind of diverse group of people who join us on these sessions, who come to learn. And we set out to do a 6-week long session, was what we had, a 10-week long session is what we had initially planned, and just through the commitment of the Indigenous Rights Alliance and of all the participants and the students, it ended up being a 6-month-long course where every Saturday we would go to this neighborhood. And again, a variety of kind of pedagogical methods, so documenting and witnessing the struggle and the police brutality and the architectures of occupation that were being used in this space, but then also oral historiography, learning from the Indigenous ecological knowledge, how not to see that land as barren. And walks being facilitated by the activists themselves, kind of learning learning also from lawyers and environmentalists, etc. So a really wide range of pedagogical methods. And then the second course that we thought we would share is Hamare Siyal Rishte, which is a more recent course and kind of still ongoing. Hamare Siyal Rishte means our watery relations. And in the same way that Gadap sessions emerged from our relationship with the Indigenous Rights Alliance and our conversations with activists there, Hamare Siyal Rishte emerges from our relationship with the Pakistan Fisher Folk Forum and our friendships and conversations with activists who have been part of, in fact, founding members of the Pakistan Fisher Folk Forum when PFF was founded in 1998, right? And so Pakistan Fisher Folk Forum was founded in Karachi in 1998, and it's a group of indigenous fisher communities who have been fighting the desecration of the coastal and riverine regions of Pakistan, and also the privatization of the waters, the privatization of the coast, and have also not only been fighting, but have also really have a lot of victories to their name, have put up an intrepid struggle. And so with Hamare Syaal Rishte, again, we wanted to collaborate with the Fisherfolk Forum, but we also brought the Indigenous Rights Alliance into that conversation as well, to acquaint ourselves with the struggles that have taken place in Karachi around river defense and coastal defense. So again, thinking about the resistance as a pedagogy and trying to acquaint our group with just the incredibly vast and rich history of what's been done to advocate for this ecology. At the time that we put together this course, there was a very vibrant resistance happening against the privatization of two small islands that are off the coast of Karachi. And those islands were being they were threatening to privatize these islands, again, of course, for private real estate. And the communities were fighting it because these islands are sacred to the community. There are shrines there. These are sacred spaces even when they are so-called uninhabited, which they are, of course, not uninhabited. And so it was really smack in the middle of that struggle and the struggle to kind of protect the mangrove ecology that we put together this course. And so we had kind of divided the course into three parts. One was looking at the coast and these coastal struggles, and then the other was looking at the riverine ecology of Karachi that has really been destroyed by sand mining and of course by construction into the river pathways. And then the third part was really trying to connect these struggles that take place in Karachi to the larger aquatic ecology of Pakistan, so beyond Karachi into Balochistan, and acquainting ourselves with the struggles that happen there.
Yeah, and I think an important part of the work that we are only realizing as we have been doing it is that I feel in our increasingly militarized times, an effect of this kind of moment of when we're all feeling the tightening grip of the military state in our lives is being overwhelmed by a feeling of isolation, or this feeling that we are alone, that we are doomed, the cynicism that is so hard not to give into. And I feel for us in this work, a really crucial kind of thing that keeps us going is this realization actually that we are really not alone. And this moment, while it feels so difficult and so unique, there is a long history in Pakistan, in Karachi, of people in communities having seen through many such moments, and that there have been many movements to resist. But somehow along the way, we have those histories from those practices, and much of the work that we set out for ourselves is how do we reconnect to these networks, to these communities, to the knowledges and the pedagogies. So a big method for us really has been to actively seek out community and activist organizations in the city, both ones that are running to this day, but also ones that have been forced to shut down or have had to go underground or can no longer run in the ways that they used to, and really to speak to these elder activists to understand what their strategies, what their tactics have been, and how can we share that with the participants of our course and create networks of conversation and exchange across these bubbles or kind of silos that get formed. And where are we on time? So should we? Okay, Nidal, do you want to join us and we can have a conversation?
Hi everyone. I feel a bit awkward to just pop on stage in the middle of the discussion. But I think just to say that I think exhaustive geographies has been like really seminal text for a lot of people in Colombo. I think our copy is really worn from use. But I think like just to kind of think about these things in a Colombo context, I think that what that publication did was it gave like I think me also permission to understand that making knowledge about the city is not something that only architects can do, not something that only urban planners can do, and that everyone, this can be a lot more inclusive and a lot like that anybody can actually make knowledge about the city. Yeah, and I think just thinking a bit about like situating a lot of the struggles in Karachi in a wider South Asian context. What really struck me was the connection, I guess this unholy nexus between the state, capital and the military, which seems to be operating in a majority of our cities in South Asia. And I think in Sri Lanka in particular, so if you look at post-war development in Colombo, it has really been a military-led kind of phenomenon. I think part of that also comes from changing the city from a city that was at war, so with checkpoints, with convoys, with high security zones, to now a city that was not at war. But the enduring power of the military does not change or evaporate overnight. So for example, if we look at, I think just over there, Shangri-La is actually military land that was given to Shangri-La for I think 125 million US dollars and also a 10-year tax concession. So when you're thinking about erasures and absences, sometimes these absences are also just tax dollars. But I think what's interesting is that we see this kind of like triad of state, capital, and military, and I think these are struggles that are also not just in Colombo. Actually, you could I think other people know this a lot better than I do. But the land grabs in the north and east, for instance, were not something that has started happening recently. I think there's this thing called the imperial boomerang, which refers to a process where if a colonial power uses a technology to suppress foreign population, eventually they will use it to suppress the local population as well. And I feel like that's exactly what has happened in Colombo. But yeah, this is also thinking a bit about like, this is happening in different ways, right? So militarization that started off, for example, in 2013, you saw with there are a lot of military-led evictions. The urban poor, I think 50% of the urban poor, there was an attempt to move them into high-rises. And I think a lot of artists have worked on this extensively, documenting the role of the military in kind of cleansing these urban spaces. But I guess what's even now, maybe 10 years later, even though it might not be as obvious or it might not be as present in the city, there are still these tracers, right? If you go to a public park, you might see STF cleaning the park. If you go to Golf Fest just here, you might see the military raising and raising a flag in the morning. So it's a lot more subtle in some ways, at least here, but that does not mean that it has like vanished, neither does it mean that that mindset has changed. It's always been about kind of governing a population. I think there's this article, journal article by Professor Jonathan Spencer and Prime Minister Heidi Amarasuriya, where they refer to the disciplining of the urban poor and this idea that if they are relocated, with that discipline will come to them. And I don't think we've really been able to move away from that mindset. But I'm curious as to how you see things. How do you think in the last 10 years you've been doing this work? Like what kind of forms of militarization have you seen evolve or change, or has it stayed static? Like I'm curious as to how you've seen those changes.
I guess just thinking about the real estate development, for instance, that we mentioned that we did our course back in 2016 on, that the expansion of that real estate development is still ongoing. And then, so it starts in 2012 and 13 years later, they are still grabbing more and more and more and more land. And the couple of real estate projects on the outskirts, their scale is so vast that like I think 3 new mega gated communities that are being formed on the outskirts of Karachi are going to be land-wise larger than the city of Karachi itself. And Karachi is a huge city, right? So the scale of expansion, expropriation, and dispossession is just so vast and so consistent that yeah, it's kind of, I feel like the militarization of space, of knowledge, one of the key players now in this outskirt area is also the education city. And again, right, at the heart of the education city is the land grab, and realizing the ways in which the university is also very much a business of money, a business of land grab, is as complicit in these transformations of land, in the dispossession, in the violence, in the erasure.
Yeah, and so then with Education City, then the university becomes, really in very literal ways, becomes, the university is instrumentalized by the state to displace, dispossess, and accumulate land. But then also I think what you had said that this quote that you had said about disciplining the poor by displacing them from their land. And part of that displacement is also you discipline these communities by displacing them from their land and so from their knowledge, from their livelihoods, from their ways of life, right? And so the university is then instrumentalized not just to accumulate land, but to wipe out a way of life. And the university doesn't only do that by occupying land, it also does that by what it then the pedagogies that it practices on that land. But I think another thing that we're seeing and we've been witnessing constantly in kind of the period of time that we've been practicing in Pakistan is also, in the years that we worked, we have really felt very, very palpably the kind of restrictions really kind of clamping down, and that, things that were possible 10 years ago in terms of just kind of, even something as simple as like filming or photographing in public space is just not possible in the same way that it once was. And so everything really feels like a total capture in a lot of ways, but of course it is also not, because as much as you see the expansion of the militarism, you also see the kind of the continued life of the resistance, so I think those are some of what we.
I think also when you talk about like the militarization of public space, where you even feel like scared to take a photo, I think that it's kind of this weird effect where like you're self-censoring yourself then, right? Even in the absence of somebody with a gun, it's penetrated your psyche to the point that you are essentially behaving in space in a way that you are being always watched. I think for example, there were a lot of like walking paths and new public spaces created by the military. And also this is at a point where urban development is also under the Ministry of Defense. Like it's no longer the case, but at that point, there's a very militarized regime of like urban governance. You have these walking paths created. And I think one of the things is that you have to walk in one direction. You can't, if you walk in another direction, somebody blows a whistle and tells you to walk in the correct direction. I mean, this is an extreme example, I think, of what happens when you militarize just like space. But I guess the question here is like, part of your pedagogy is also going into the streets, going into like public spaces and like reclaiming these public spaces. So I guess I'm just curious as to how do the people who do these courses, like, is there like a kind of unlearning process, or is it like how do they kind of relate, and how does it change just the process of learning in a classroom or on a Zoom lecture would I guess be the worst on the worst end of the spectrum, versus like being situated in this like field site.
I think in Karachi, especially in the last decade, there's been a real glorification of university spaces as safe zones, as this will be safe for you to come and study, but everything outside is unsafe. Yeah. And I think part of our work is telling people, no, public spaces are where it's safe, it's the institutions where you're being watched, and it's in the institutional walls that actually we can't do what we want to do, but that in the kind of anonymity of public space, there still is pockets of freedom to be found. But I think, to respond to your question, I feel a lot of the people who reach out to us and end up participating in the courses are already people who are awakening to these realities, who already have some kind of a realization of feeling a disenchantment with existing educational institutions, or feeling some kind of curiosity with activist work that's been going on, but who are struggling to get an in, who don't really know the activists or the organizations, and really use our course as a way to build networks. And I think part of the structure of our courses are that there is no real output of the course. The process is everything. And so in that way, what each participant takes with them is their own, and what they make of it is their own. So everyone goes on to do different kinds of things, whether it's academic research work, whether it's doing more activist work,
Yeah, and I think which is also not to say that the streets are perfectly safe spaces, and that we do have to be very transparent and clear when we have our open calls and we have our first sessions with students and participants that we aren't always, we can't guarantee that we are going to be safe, but the enemy is not who you think it is. It's really what we need to stay safe from is not what you would normally think. So we do have to be transparent about that, and it's not that it hasn't been without hiccups. There have been plenty, but I think part of also that then the kind of realization that comes with that is just like what's possible when you do things together, what becomes possible when you move in groups, when you move in a collective, and how there is a safety that comes with numbers, and that and you don't always know what changes when you're in a group, and so that's one thing that comes up. But also I think kind of also connected to your previous question and what Shahana was saying about the university, there's also really been this witnessing of, with this real acceleration of militarism and authoritarianism, what you witness then is not that the cultural sector kind of contracts or becomes smaller. We're also witnessing simultaneously this expansion of a militarized cultural sector, right? Of a sanitized cultural sector. So it's not that, so there is, in those years, in the years that we've been practicing, there are more universities in Karachi than there were before. And their walls are 20 feet taller, and they have 20 times the amount of armed security that they need to have where they once had. They have, barricaded, kind of, you walk through those detectors, blah, blah. And there are literature festivals that you have to kind of be frisked to walk into, and there are behind 20-foot high walls, and you have to walk through metal detectors to get to. And so there is this like incredibly sanitized, securitized cultural sector that is booming, that is like massively, massively growing, that is funded by this military state, that is part of that militarization project. And so then to have this practice that happens outside of those barricades feels really necessary, and also kind of and is this and so to make sure that it still feels possible to do things in unsecuritized ways, and in spontaneous ways, and anywhere and everywhere feels just absolutely necessary.
I think just in reference to that universities and proliferation, I think I was reading, I think you had this article that came out in last year, talking about, I think, like enclosures of land and enclosures of knowledge, and it's like this massive like land grab that is happening for a university, and it's quite scary actually if you think about like maybe even worse than a shrinking cultural space is the kind of creation of like one that is just apolitical, maybe it's more insidious. But I think in that article there was a great line where you said, you were talking about, I think, somebody land was being grabbed, and there's this line where you say, the police left and the surveyors arrived. And which I think is a great way to kind of also frame the second, which is, I don't know whether it precedes militarization or it's just an integral part of it, but map making and kind of processes of the tools of making knowledge about space as a colonial legacy. But also you could argue just, I don't know if we can continuously as South Asian societies blame everything on colonialization, like yes and no, but you can't ignore the fact that these things have now morphed into something else. But I think like just again thinking about these processes of map making as this tool of like domination, of conquest, but also something that maybe can be co-opted and or at least used as a strategy of resistance, because it is also still another tool that is available. And I'm just wondering how you negotiate these complexities.
So to give context to everyone, Miguel, the article she's talking about is looking at the occupation that the education city in Karachi is doing. And it's this moment we're speaking to this villager who's, I think 90 acres of his land have been snatched from him by the police just showing up and demanding that he give over that land. And he manages to get some activists and they make a human chain. They manage to protect his agricultural land, but then the surveyors arrive and they say, no, we're just surveying, we'll do this process. And when he receives the official survey, he says that his 5,000 trees on his land are missing from the survey, and how the map is purposefully showing empty land when it is not, and then how that map is then used to force him to give up that land for construction of a building. And I feel like a very early encounter that I was remembering as you were speaking about this kind of violence that happens very early on when me and Zahra had started working together. There was the China-Pakistan economic corridor was revitalizing some of the railway lines of the city. And those were threatening to displace communities, working class communities that were living along the railway lines. And we had went to see one of those spaces. We had been invited, and we were standing by the railway line, and I think I took out my phone to take a picture or something. And the activist had told me, please don't keep your phone away, because they'll think you're a surveyor. If you come here and you start taking pictures, the camera is really seen as a weapon in these communities, that it's literally the method through which land is being represented and then occupied. So yeah, very early on we were really aware of these devices and processes being used against communities and against land.
Yeah.
But maybe you can speak to the counterpart of it.
Yeah, we had to be careful not to give surveyor energy. But yeah, I think with mapping, we've like really come 180 to, well, yeah, I guess,
A full circle.
So we started out kind of thinking and really witnessing the ways in which the maps were being really weaponized by the state to create this atmosphere of pervasive fear in Karachi, and this sense that the city is an insecure space that needs immediately to be securitized, right? And that's what then, the city then becomes reproduced in the map's image. All of these kind of barricades propping up, and the no-go zones that were once inhabited by people are now absolutely annihilated, pieces of land, etc. And we were kind of, again, really aware that this mapping practice that we were seeing, this militarized mapping that we were seeing in 2013, that then kind of manufactures consent for the Karachi military operation that happens at the end of 2013. We were really aware that this is very much in continuity with the colonial legacy of map making. And we really had these kind of texts by colonizers like Richard Burton and to kind of attest to that. And so when we did Exhausted Geographies 1, we were thinking of ways in which to engage with map-making practices that could imagine or tell other stories about Karachi. And in the work that we did in the years that followed, even with Gadap sessions and the course that we did, we were just kind of constantly really aware of how much maps were just so central to occupation and accumulation, and how much that when we tried to partake in the tools of map making, we were entering into the frameworks of those colonial ways of seeing and thinking of land, and needing to and wanting to work outside of that and create different visualities that don't fall back on those tools and tropes of map making, line drawing, the God's eye view, the kind of fetish of precision and scale, and these kind of things, the flattening and the reduction of the land, the erasure of humans or trees from the land, etc. But I think recently we've also become really aware of the fact that we do keep in our practice, in our research, and in the Karachi LaJamia sessions, maps keep coming up, and we do keep going back to the map form, and there is something about the ritual or the ceremony or that moment in which a person draws a map for another person, and that ritual or that moment of making a map to represent your own land, or not necessarily to represent your own land on this dead piece of paper that then becomes this fixed document, but to draw in order to show someone the way, as an act of hospitality, as an act of care, as an act of, as a kind of a gift to someone, to then think of the map not as a noun, but as a verb, and think about what it means to, as an act of hospitality, to give that to someone, and being witness to that moment in which somebody tells their story or the story of their land by tracing something onto, a napkin in a tea stall, that we stopped at the end of a long day of research, or at, just sitting down and like drawing it onto the sand, just to kind of be like, this is how you make your way to my friend's house, So I think that really the process of doing this work has kind of redeemed the map form for us, as this kind of act of connection and collectivity and kindness.
And I feel a lot of these maps that people have been making for us, especially in the last few years, have been maps of rivers. And a lot of Karachi's rivers are actually fast disappearing. They're really an endangered ecobody. And in the research and in conversations that we have with activists and elders, a lot of maps of rivers have been drawn for us. And we've been thinking a lot about, as Zahra was saying, yes, this act of mapping is an act of hospitality, but also the act of mapping as a way of protecting, invoking, animating endangered worlds. That representation here is not about erasure or obstruction or violence. That representation here is about memory, about relation, about survival, about finding a way to continue to give form to landscapes that are no more or that are disappearing. And so in that way, the map, we're really thinking also or realizing this other side of...
Yeah, like in that sense, the map becomes this ritual of remembrance, but also kind of then coming to this realization, because Shahana and I both had the privilege and the violence of a colonial art education. And so also kind of coming to this realization that it is a really specifically European framework and epistemology of paper and drawing that imagines that when you draw something, you create something that's inanimate, or that is still, or that is a fixed image. And in so many of our cultures, historically, drawing has been a way to cast a spell. Drawing has been a way to create an energetic artifact that then lives, that moves in people's, necklaces, in people's pockets, in people's around people's wrists, and that piece of paper is not, you know, like in art, in contemporary art, we kind of talk about new media as like moving image, but we think of like paper, drawings on paper or painting as like the still image, the fixed image, something stagnant, something that's not dynamic. But in practices like making amulets or talismans or calligraphy, you know, we imagine that when you do this ritual on a piece of paper, you create an energetic artifact that then has power, that then moves through space with a certain kind of power. So then also kind of rethinking this idea of like to rethink the idea of colonial map making, we also need to rethink and get rid of this idea that a drawing is something that is dead and desacralized, a drawing
Or
can also
secular.
be, or secular practice, exactly, and kind of unthinking that as well. And I think for us in our research practice, in our pedagogical practice, that kind of ritual, that communion, that ceremony of not just drawing maps but passing them around between us and the life that they take on as they move, you know, with us, with our bodies, has been a way of learning that for us.
I think when you talk about like maps as this dynamic object, I'm also thinking about just ecologies, right? And also the colonial encounter with these ecologies, like seeing a desert and thinking, okay, there's nothing there. But also I guess in Colombo, the equivalent would be seeing a wetland and thinking, oh, this is going to give me, you know, malaria, because it looks terrifying. And I mean, I have this colonial idea that malaria is actually caused by fogs and swamps. Like even in the way that we think of wetlands now, I think now there's this move to think of wetlands as, you know, kind of biologically diverse places. We put that into a park, you know, the World Bank will fund the park, it will be great. But like, there's still idea that wetlands exist as this kind of in-between place, but also one that I guess defies the logic of the map, which is fixity, right? Like just as you talk about these rivers that might emerge for a period of time and then cease to emerge. Like even wetlands are constantly moving back and forth depending on seasons. So there's something very, I think, unsatisfying to colonizers about this dynamic landscape, but also a landscape that may not be productive in the way that they think it is. But I guess what is amazing about your work is that also you keep coming back to these indigenous forms of knowledge, these indigenous forms of memory that have been erased. And I guess these ways of knowing ecology that have been erased. And I think it reminds me a bit of, I guess, some work that's been done on wetlands in Sri Lanka, where I think this Misaka Hettiarachchi actually looks at like pre-colonial poetry, and he looks at these kind of poems that people who go on the rivers are saying, and he uses that as a means of constructing what the ecology would have been like. So he's saying, okay, there are these references to grasses, there are these references to lotuses, and then he kind of draws this parallel to what is happening now. And you kind of get this baseline, which is also ecologically rich, and it's also information, right? But obviously this is stuff that people who live in these landscapes know very intimately. I think we don't need to like come as outsiders and tell them that this information is valid. But I guess that thinking about like the knowledge that you're creating, and especially when you're relying on activists, you're relying on indigenous knowledge, it's a very like hyper-local kind of practice. How do you see that in relation to, I guess, like broader conversations? How do you think there's a need to situate it like regionally or nationally, or like how do you take the local and the indigenous and move it up, even if you need to move it up at all? Yes.
That's an important question, and it's a question that's really been on our minds, I think, the last year or two. And yeah, I feel like for many years, the work we were doing was very situated in Karachi and for Karachi, and that was the only audience that we were interested in and wanted to work with and be in dialogue with. But I think in the last 2 years, we have also had the opportunities of being in international spaces, being asked to exhibit some of the work or share some of our research. And I think those invitations have really forced us to then think about these questions of what does it mean to be sharing this work, what should we be sharing, and how does it translate? And I feel more often than not, something that I've personally been so surprised by is across so many different cities and so many different countries, you don't even need to give the context really. People get it. It translates in a second of people are like, of course, yeah, we can relate to this is happening here. And I feel like seeing those kinds of reactions has kind of, I guess, allowed us to also see the possibility of the ways in which you can share this work, and we should be sharing this work. And I think one other thing that we've also been thinking about is that, especially in part of our research has also been looking at and trying to understand better activist histories and the ways in which the organizations we work with now, how did they form, what moments did they form in, and some of these organizations that formed in the 90s were actually formed in a moment where there was immense networks and solidarities across the global south and especially in South Asia. So the one organization that Zahra mentioned called the Pakistan Fisherfolk Forum that gets founded in 1998. Before they are founded throughout the 90s, they are visiting every city in Asia. They're going to India, they're coming to Sri Lanka, they're going to Thailand, they're going to Philippines, they're going to Nepal, they're going all across through all of these conferences and workshops that are happening, and are getting to exchange and come into contact with different ways of working, different strategies. And one of the founders of the Pakistan Fisherfolk Forum always tells the origin story of PFF by talking about how it was a conference that he attended in Sri Lanka that gave him the idea to found PFF. Because at that time, Pakistan had no kind of activist organization as a model, but he came here and he saw that there were so many fisher organizations and unions and co-ops that were running, and that it was learning those things that allowed him to imagine that kind of a way of being in Pakistan as well. And he has all of these really beautiful stories of, of course, in these really international spaces and sessions, language was a huge barrier. And he was at the Sri Lanka conference, he always tells us this, that they had a drawing workshop led by a translator and an artist who just encouraged them to communicate by drawing. And he said that for the next 5 days, that's all we did. And we were just drawing for each other. And he was like, it really worked. And so you had to really even think of how drawing is also most simply a process of communication. And that, so much of kind of thinking about solidarity or cross-regional conversation or networks, these are also things that have existed from long before this moment. And how do we look back to better understand how we can be in some ways as well? I don't know if that...
Yeah, and I think when we were first doing, for many years of Karachi LaJamia, the way that the practice was happening, it was the work was the practice, and it was very much happening in really specific, site-specific ways on ground in Karachi. And it was also about kind of really, kind of also trying to find wealth of knowledge around ecology and resistance that exists in the region, that is, in a lot of ways difficult to access. But I think even in those years, we were really influenced by, and we were gaining a lot of insight from also referencing scholarly work or even film work that was being done in the region in places like Sri Lanka and India and Bangladesh to help us understand, because the struggles are a lot of the phenomena and the struggles are so similar. So much of the history is a shared history in so many ways. And so we have always been really influenced by work that has come from the region. We were especially, I think in the early years of Karachi LaJamia, a lot of scholarship from Palestine was really, really helpful for us as well in understanding land accumulation and appropriation and those processes. So I think it's kind of, it is inevitable and has been in terms of kind of referencing and even like conversations. So for example, last year when, 2 years ago when we were together in, when we had been invited for wetlands and thinking, being exposed to and learning about the ways that in which wetlands are framed and understood in this context better helped us kind of give us things to go back to Karachi with. So I think, yeah, I think in that sense, and then also then becoming aware of the fact that these conversations, you know, borders are so much more porous than we think, and these conversations have been happening for such a long time, and in a lot of ways we imagine that this world is becoming this increasingly mobile space, but actually these conversations are less now than they were in the 90s or in the 2000s, you know, so it's harder to cross these borders than it was a while back when they were actually really, really porous, especially between Pakistan and India, for example. So I think, yeah, and I think that another thing is kind of, that's really important to also, that we've also witnessed in this period of time is that our states are more collaborative than we think. They share knowledge with each other, they share tools with each other. You know, we know that they share surveillance softwares with each other. We know that they learn from each other's specific practices and rituals of brutality. And in that sense, it's so necessary that we kind of also do that kind of, in that same spirit of collaboration, share tools with each other.
It's nice to know that, I think that's a nice way to maybe end this part of the conversation. Shall we open it up for Q&A? Maybe we'll take about 2-3 questions.
I hope that my voice is louder. So I really inspired when you say that when you compare the university spaces, space with the public space, that's quite safer, you feel. So my question is about like nowadays we are living in a time people always invest time for money like that. So the thing is like when you as a kind of people who wanted to engage with the people who struggle, you always open to work with them. But in the other side, when people who are suffering, who are in struggle, the local people, they always have a kind of fear to engage with the activists who go from outside. Because the first step they might have some kind of asking, like some kind of questions like why these people are reaching us, what is the purpose for them from us, and also sometimes maybe they might ask you for financial support or something. Like in those situations, do you face these kind of situations? And in those situations, what you like, how you handle them? And also the second one is like, it's almost 10 years you reach in this point. So like when you start to work with these people, you might have a kind of milestone. You might plan something like you have to achieve or you have to reach a kind of certain point. So was that happen, or like are you on the way to that? So I just wanted to get the answers for 2 questions.
There's one more question at the back.
First of all, thank you for your incredible and very necessary work. Also thanks to Miguel for weaving in our local experience into the work that you're doing. And maybe to zoom out, I mean, we're in this polycrisis because of the displacement and degradation, ecological degradation, and really, as you guys spoke about, the erasure of ways of living and indigenous knowledge. And so you mentioned that your course works with a really diverse range of people, from pediatricians to activists. So I guess also to the previous question, how do you sensitize your participants to really listen, to capture that knowledge, that way of living, without projecting, quite often our institutionalized education onto them, and how do you know, allow them to listen without projecting any of the education that we've had in the past, and then in doing so, I'm sorry, it's a two-pronged question. In doing so, how have you seen these, for example, the maps evolve from a colonial kind of two-dimensional map to this living, dynamic, you know, ritual? And how have you seen then that, maybe that evolution, how have you witnessed that evolution, and maybe how has that changed or been different to, you mentioned like the indigenous group asked you to map, and in using these different pedagogies to map, how has it served them maybe differently? So I'd love to hear a little bit about the process of the course, and then what have you guys witnessed in that evolution of what you're creating with your students or your cohorts?
Shall we answer these two?
Yeah,
and then
these
do one
are
more?
really in-depth questions. Maybe I'll respond to Jasmine's question first, and then Zahra can continue. I'm trying to
I think the first question was about resources, about money, and
about going into communities, right? I think it's been a huge learning for us, of course, as we do this work. And from the get-go, one method that we had employed, and that from the beginning we wanted to do things that way, was for every course we organize, we always collaborate with a community organization who is embedded in the community, and who we have existing relationships with, who we either reach out to or they reach out to us to organize something. And so there's a mutual kind of interest and decision that let's do something together. And so when we go into the community, it's not just as outsiders, but we're being taken in through community activists who are part of those neighborhoods. So I think that allows for the community also to build, to have a level of trust. And because I think, yeah, otherwise if you go on your own, more often than not, you will be met with suspicion. And then the other part of your question, I feel like one of the assumptions we made was also right, that can we as outsiders go into these spaces? What is our right to be going in and asking these questions and doing this research, and all of these critical, reflexive questions that can also be really self-paralyzing of just wanting to do things right. And I think one thing we found, again, more often than not, is a lot of these communities and people who are experiencing immense violence want people to come and to witness, to have solidarity, to be seen for their suffering and struggle, to be seen by others. And then, I feel an important part of the work becomes witnessing that in collectivity and forming relationships to be in that space together. And Zahra says this thing that I always really like, that in some ways it's also a grief practice of just coming together and witnessing, where there is no output of, oh, we're gonna save this, we're gonna stop this development that's outside of our power. And we know that there's no way that we as artists are going to be able to stop anything, and we're really transparent to the communities that we work with, that is not our role and that's not our capacity. But that, we are here to create spaces of witnessing, learning, sharing.
Yeah, and I think about resources and about the 10-year journey. I think when we started out Karachi LaJamia, we had never planned on, we had really thought it was a one-time thing. It was like a pop-up course in response to some really intense state brutality that had happened around that time. And it was really, again, it was a grief practice. It was like a ritual in remembrance and hope, because we just think, there was just a lot of state brutality happening, and we wanted to believe that it was still possible to do this work. And so the first course that we did was just about connecting with activist organizations and community centers and community libraries in Karachi to, again, kind of do that ritual of like, we exist, this network of resistance exists, it's still alive, and to have those moments of connection together. And then when we started doing, we just found there was a lot of interest in terms of participants, but also in terms of collaborators and activist groups in continuing to do this work. And we were doing it without any funding, and so really the way that we did it was mutual aid. We did not have any funds that we were bringing to the table, and we did not ask our participants to pay anything. Any space that we used, was given to us by activists to use their spaces. And the only expenses that we would end up having were transportation. And so everyone would pitch in for transportation. Was really a small amount. And that was how we were working for a very long time. And I think for us, it was just, there wasn't really a goal. Again, it's not goal-oriented work. Otherwise, I think if you do goal-oriented work, you will get tired or you will lose hope. And so again, at the heart of it was just the desire that as long as we can keep doing this work, we just want to keep doing this work. And as long as it's sustainable and everyone is happy and everyone who's involved feels like it's valuable, that's all that matters. But I think that spirit kept us going for a while, but then I do think at some point, we're not young anymore. At some point, like questions of sustainability and energy and all of these things do come up. And I think we've been really lucky that around the time that these questions started coming up for us, there was the work that we had been doing in obscurity, people became interested in it. And just as people started becoming interested, like for example now Asia Society, but like in the last year or two, or last year, we were here for Colombo Scope. There's been a lot of regional interest as well. And this kind of interest has been giving us resources to make sure that we can keep doing Karachi LaJamia. So for example, now what people would ask us all the time, because the Karachi LaJamia courses had to be very small scale, and that kind of also answers your question of how do we handle, how do we make sure that everything happens in a sensitive and mindful, thoughtful way, is by making sure that everything is always small scale. Not, we've only ever been maximum 18 participants. And so everything happens slowly and on a very small scale. And that's how we're able to make sure that everything is happening sensitively and softly. But the thing that happened over the years was that a lot of people would reach out and be like, okay, now can you circulate the materials? Can you circulate your research? Can you circulate what you all learned? And we didn't really have the time or resources for that. But now that people are interested, we're able to now produce pedagogical materials. So we've been printing booklets that give case studies of our courses. We've been making children's books that tell the stories of the rivers. So now that resources are coming, we're able to do more things. But for the longest time, we were also doing it with little resources. But in terms of what's the like 10-year goal, I think just the fact that we're still doing the work is what's,
to survive.
Yeah.
But are we?
We're very much.
Okay, so maybe your question, I will just talk to you after.
Should we?
Thank you so much for this. I know we could have gone on for another hour, but thank you to Shahana, Zahra for the presentation. Thank you, Meghal, for moderating, and thank you all for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.